Hi everybody, and very happy here now to moderate this panel. We see here Monica, Luis, Dennis, and Carlos. Hi everybody. Quick introduction about myself. I'm working with payments and risk management based in Germany, and have been this for the last decades. Right now, very quick introduction for everybody. I will ask everybody just to spend a couple of words to say hi to the audience. Carlos, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, Marco, and hi, everyone here. So to start, my name is Carlos Palma. I am a product manager at DLocal. And for those who are not familiar with DLocal, we are a payment service provider that specializes in emerging markets. So we started in Latin America, but we are currently operating in Africa and Asia as well. And we help companies enter these emerging markets with a single unified integration, covering that both cards and alternative payment methods as well.
Thank you, Carlos. Monica, we heard from you already. Would you like to add something else before starting the panel?
Sure, I'll add one soundbite given the audience. So not only do we, so when you look at resolving any type of dispute, then our platform also resolves disputes for alternative payment methods as well as loyalty cards and private cards or private label cards. So just a little interesting tidbit that would apply to our audience today.
Thank you for that. Luis?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Marco. My name is Luis Duker. I'm the Enterprise Sales Director here at SecuredTouch. I work with various different airlines, OTAs, and hotels, and other merchants in e-commerce to basically stop fraud, stop ATO, stop chargebacks before any damage is done early in the actual user journey.
Thank you, Luis. And Dennis, last but not least.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Dennis. Also, Monica, great to see you again after quite a while. I'm heading the payments and fraud efforts at FlixBus right now for a couple of months. Also 15 years within the industry, from airline to hotel to tourism activities, vacation rentals, and ultimately right now responsible for the mobility piece. Yeah, really lucky to be on board and still in the industry, and yeah, really looking forward to the discussions to come.
Thank you, Dennis. Again, thanks everybody for being here. Just a note for the audience: if you have any question, just feel free to shoot them. We will try to pick them over the call. What are we going to cover? Of course, we are talking about payments and frauds, and we will cover today where we are right now and what you're expecting to be next. And I think we have a very good, very good experts here on the panel. Starting, Luis, what changes are you currently seeing from partners? So especially like looking at how sales patterns have been changing due to COVID, basically.
So you're talking about sales patterns. Yeah, so there has been a dramatic change in, let's say, the overall numbers as far as transactions from both legitimate users and fraudulent users since COVID has occurred. So obviously the actual transaction rate, the actual amount of fraud that's happening is much lower, but the fraud rate itself, so the percentage of the overall fraud is actually higher than it is before COVID has occurred. So even though the overall numbers are down, the fraud rate is still quite high. And we're seeing a lot more non-transactional based fraud. So we're talking about account takeover and new account fraud. And fraudsters are really branching out and developing new monetization methods. And these numbers are growing rapidly. Stuff like they're doing like with ghost accounts, things that don't necessarily involve a chargeback or anything that looks fraudulent just from the mere glance. But these are they're staging basically their fraudulent activity for later on once more destinations are opened.
That's really interesting. I agree with that. I'm like, so something similar. Dennis, what do you see from your side?
Yeah, I think, speaking out from a merchant perspective, I think I can pretty much mirror what the overall travel industry has been seeing, specifically OTAs and airlines, right? When the pandemic were hitting us in March last year, sales went literally to zero. And then obviously, chargebacks kicked in. So, just the subsequent, or as Luis just mentioned, the percent of revenue generated was of frauds received was significantly high. I personally have never seen ECP rates on the PSP dashboards that high, you know, going to 20, 30-ish percent points in some instances. Obviously, that was waived from the schemes at that point because they've also seen the pain from the merchant side. Literally for us at FlixBus, we have basically, you know, seeing the trend moving where we, you know, reduced our frequencies and networks. So basically the fraud shifted them to the markets where we still operated in. Then we had a lot of time where the whole network was hibernated, and literally we also aimed, you know, to exchange a lot of pre-sold tickets into vouchers. And this was, you know, for us the first experience when we have seen, you know, those late stage friendly fraud behaviors that, you know, when they thought of, you know, I'm going to travel in a month or 2 month time, and then they literally realize it's not going to happen. They simply just filed the original transaction as a chargeback, although they have received the voucher, which at least on our side caused some challenges because we've never built a complex model in-house to basically observe and maintain that properly in that short amount of time. But I think at least the good side is, you know, we're picking up from day to day, see high growth rates and demand in different markets. US is pretty in a leading position here, followed by UK, where vaccination is, you know, really going on speedily, and, you know, it's harmonizing a little, but ultimately, you know, the trend of fraud was moving with the countries where we have operated. So there was no major trend change as such. It's literally they just followed the possibilities of to do so.
Yeah, I guess I'm like, surely you are you've been heavily affected, and many changes for you as well. Carlos, you are working in Latin America, and there historically we have seen that fraud attacks have been always high. How do you see that right now?
Yeah, so fraud attack rates in Latin America, and speaking more broadly for developing markets in general, so including Africa and Asia as well, these markets have traditionally been higher than most developed nations in terms of fraud attack rates. So, for example, in the US, where an apparel manufacturer might see 1% chargeback rates, it is not uncommon for the same merchant to have rates as high as 3 to 4% in these markets if they're not well prepared to tackle fraud. So one of the things is that although there are definitely regional differences between the different markets in the ways consumers use different payment methods, and therefore the fraud scheme is observed, in general, fraudsters will use the same principles, and we've seen similar trends happening across these markets. So one of the things that we've seen over the past year is that some markets were traditionally high, such as Argentina, Mexico, Brazil. These were known to have high fraud rates. But then what we've seen is that other countries in the region have seen their fraud rates increase, often getting to the levels of these markets. So the whole region is being affected greatly by the last changes in fraud. So particularly over the last year, because of the social distancing and city lockdowns that have been implemented in this region, have been very common. People have been pushed to online shopping very strongly. And even though we've seen this happen in developed economies, the impact has been much greater in emerging markets. So, for example, in Latin America, according to a recent study, the digital transactions have grown up to 3 times faster than the global average growth. So, of course, this is a huge opportunity, but also has massive implications for fraud. For established players, people who are already in the space, they, of course, will see their sales volume increase, and therefore the level of overall fraud that they will see, which makes them, might put them in a situation where they need to be aware of chargeback programs. But then for new entrants, they face much more difficulties because they might not be familiar with the particularities of the countries where they want to join, or the industry, or the way to operate. So without having the right processes in place, they're particularly vulnerable to entering into these new markets, and fraudsters have definitely taken advantage of these companies. So on the other hand, there's been another massive challenge for emerging markets, and this is related to the number of new customers that have entered this space. We're talking about people that have no online footprint, so it's difficult to tell them apart from fraudsters or fake accounts. And when a merchant is entering these new markets, they might be too restrictive or too conservative in the ways that they control for fraud and set up rules. So they might be missing a large segment of the population if they don't have an alternative strategy in place of dealing with these customers.
Yeah, surely I might imagine how complicated it might be, especially for merchants which are expanding in South America and they had not really a lot of experience with the local market. There might be very, very complicated, and surely this can be a problem. Monica, like from your side, you talked before about chargebacks. How would you summarize the current state for the airline and travel industry, considering that we are more or less restarting in many markets?
Sure. I think to just on the back of what Dennis was saying, a term that we use is double dipping, and the travel industry got hit hard. And what we've just seen, and I think this is something that we definitely are seeing a trajectory of growth for this. And what happens and it really has been a catalyst, right? You have COVID, which has created a lot of financial insecurity. Of course, we've had several major airlines as well suffer consequences of delayed refunds, and as a result, you have a legitimate opportunity for a chargeback. Not to mention, you have all sorts of travel bonds and different insurances that may have also provided protection mechanism where the consumer can get funding. So bottom line, what's happened since 2020 until now is we've kind of retrained consumers on how to get the most guaranteed way of getting a refund. And oftentimes when it's come to airlines, OTAs, virtually anything in travel, that when they utilize a chargeback in combination with contacting the merchant to get a refund, in combination with their travel insurance or anything else, they're getting a double refund and sometimes a triple refund. So that strategy is paying off in spades, and it's becoming exploited. And so I really, that's definitely a threat to the industry. It's a huge cost. It's sometimes very difficult to match up these transactions and make sure that you're not warranting that type of double activity, because it definitely gets exploited. I think it's more important than ever especially for airlines and OTAs to engage. I know addressing debit memos is not the popular thing, but this is something that provides absolute crucial feedback, and this is something that it can, by allowing OTAs the ability to respond with adequate data in order to refute that chargeback, the airline is going to suffer less new chargebacks as a result. And this is something we need to look at. What is the long-term strategy? Because it's not just, we aren't going to solve the problem by looking at the stopgap measure. We've already learned we really have to address this holistically. And it really begins with re-educating consumers that there is a consequence for committing friendly fraud, and making sure that all stakeholders can participate in reducing this kind of flywheel effect that we currently have going on.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, can imagine as well how this has been an issue for several merchants. Another issue, we all know that everybody's been cutting budgets due to COVID and trying to survive basically. But right now the industry is restarting, and hopefully we'll fully restart as soon as possible. So how travel merchants are actually seeing budgets right now when it comes to fraud prevention? Do you see anything about that? I'm like, is this still on the priority list, or many are not looking at that? Monica, on your side.
Go ahead. Shall I take it?
Yeah, it's Monica.
Okay. So I do not see that this is at the forefront of their budget right now. Especially, in talking with some of the largest OTAs. I was on a panel maybe a month ago with Orbitz. There's this, it's exciting. There's new revenue opportunities, much more than I think any of us realized would be here. We all anticipated a nice gradual shift back into the normal. And it's pretty much like, no, this is COVID and the reverse. So by default, you have to make sure that your investment and your budget is catered to customer service, your product, making sure you're taking advantage of marketplace revenue opportunities like Chris was talking about, figuring out how to separate all the different upsells and cross sells, because and knowing your customer. So I don't see that. I think things have caught us by surprise again, ironically. That I don't see that identifying a budget for this activity has become front and center, because it wasn't anticipated that we would we wouldn't have a gradual increase.
Dennis, you wanted to add something. How do you see that?
Yeah, sure. Because budget is a good example, right? And Monica, you said that pretty well. I mean, I've never seen so many budget iterations than in nowadays, right? Because as you just mentioned, from one day to another, the whole situation changes within the whole market. So typically, at least on the merchant side, you're going to finalize your budget for the entire year to come, right? The year before, and then typically you're going to work with reforecast, which literally is done every second week right now, because you adjust, every moment from left to right, top down, and basically you just react on what the politicians basically decide on whether cross-border travel is allowed in specific European regions, Poland, Germany, or vice versa. So you basically just react on that. And at least what I can say is, within my former role at Get Your Guide, as well as now as with FlixBus is, and I fully agree with Monica, is the customer attention to detail and being feel in their shoes. So basically what we introduced in both of the companies was there was no question asked when they basically want to get refunded. We basically did that because we knew what is going to happen if we don't do that, because you have experienced all of the chargebacks which are kicking in. And then basically the question, is there a closer attention of the management? I do think so, at least in our case, because what we have decided on, we budgeted our fraud or chargeback losses throughout the entire year, and although the top line is significantly lower than we originally anticipated, we keep the budget in line, because obviously, as just discussed, patterns are changing from one day to another, and we basically believe we are more on the secured side than to not, under budget things and be in a little more luxury position to react to the market trends, which we then see, and basically put all of our knowledge into resolving, rather than totally over exceeding the budget lines month per month, and then ultimately causing a write-off loss by the end of the year, which no one has anticipated. And then obviously also your work is really getting questioned, whether you have then forecasted that properly or executed well with your team around that.
Thank you, Dennis. I think that forecasting, is a very, very big word, very hard right now. Let's hope we will be back to times where we are able to forecast like in a proper way and seeing easy outcomes. Like Lewis, on your side, basically like budget can be influenced as well from where fraud teams are sitting, right? If fraud teams are sitting in one division, they might have more budget than others, and so on and so on. Based on your experience, where do you think fraud teams should actually sit within a company in order to have like the best budgets, and where actually are sitting in most of the cases?
Yeah, that's a good question, Marco. I mean, look, we see it's either part of the security organization, like a fraud team sits with security, but also it's traditionally part of the finance. So like if there's chargebacks, obviously they have to deal with the finance. But ideally, fraud should sit in security because of all the pre-transaction fraud that occurs, regardless of whether a transaction occurs or a chargeback occurs. So we're talking about bots and ATO. So as I mentioned, chargebacks are pretty much, they sit with the fraud department, but it's a continuum. So there really isn't a great deal of sense to divide the two different parts. And it's similar to what Michael spoke about earlier, about his example of the finance and the loyalty departments not communicating. And what that ends up happening is an increase of chargebacks, because fraudsters know that there's probably a disconnect between the two different departments. They might use different tools, and with that, they know how to exploit it. And because of the whole time sensitive nature of travel, it goes unnoticed, or the chargeback comes too late.
True. I actually remember last year when I was speaking at one of the events where we were talking about COVID-19, and we were really focusing on the communication topic, where the teams had to actually communicate and exchange information, especially the customer support was super important for the refunds and being sure that everything was communicated internally, avoiding the double or triple refunds and so on and so on. So completely agree about this point. Dennis, question to you, maybe as we are talking again about budgets. How can we get more management buy-in basically for supporting fraud prevention, especially in this time? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, I'm a big believer that fraud as such should not be treated as a standalone topic. So what I envision always to senior management is to see payments and fraud in one big bucket, right? So specifically, if you take FlixBus as an example, we had hyper growth, our evaluated $1 billion tech company right now, and speed is always everything, and quite often specifically fraud is being ignored. But I think if you really have your lessons learned and you hire the right people with the senior knowledge to exactly bring in that knowledge, that it is not always too late. So basically combine the efforts in one department. That would be my suggestion, because then you can literally also work pretty closely together when it comes to market strategies or go-to-market strategies. What kind of payment methods do you use? Shall we enroll SCA in a dedicated market for specific thresholds in combination with the patterns and findings you have historically been seen. So therefore, I think if you do that completely standalone, which I've quite often seen in travel companies or majority in airlines, I was part of that myself back at Air Berlin for 5 years. So we were just a fraud department, and no one knew, what kind of methods were changed, added, offboarded. Is there liability? Yes, no, maybe, and I think if you combine those work streams and make the big picture visible to the management, that it is not only a cost line within the P&L, but also causes opportunity. If those departments work really collaboratively together, I think that could cause better attention and the higher willingness to treat this department as they should deserve it.
So Marco, can I comment on that? So okay, totally agree. And this is, I will steal a line from one of my clients, way back when, and they said, actually, when I look at investing in my chargeback and fraud solution, then I go to my management team, not saying this is like insurance, it's security, because it's difficult to get budget for making things safe when it doesn't. You're competing with the sex appeal of revenue, right? So he says, so I think, hey, our business is like a Ferrari. And in order for this to run, we need the best tires. We need the best petrol. Otherwise, we're not going to go as fast as we can go. And so this is really a revenue, it's going to propel our revenue. And that's what we need it for, so that sales and marketing can continue to expand. I always thought that is absolutely genius, so that it really becomes, this is making sure the business can grow.
Monica, I'm really a big fan of Ferrari, so thank you for mentioning that. And,
but they're not very fun if you can't drive them fast, right?
Yeah, exactly. But you need to be safe, and that's what I'm saying to a lot of merchants when I'm communicating and talking. It's like, okay, I'm like, you need to exactly look at your business using the best technology, using the best tools and opportunities, and of course you need to pay for those. I know nothing is coming for free. Ferraris are very expensive, but they are very unique. But of course, the return on investment can be very, very high if you use the right technology, you have the right talents, the right teams, and so on and so on. So I think that especially in these moments where everybody's looking at budgets and struggling a bit, might be a little bit harder, and it's very, very important to politically as well, like convince people, I think. But yeah, big fan of Ferrari. Carlos, on your side, changing a little bit topic, do you see a little bit of switching and shifting channels when it comes to fraudsters, attacks, and behaviors?
So yeah, so in some situations, if we're speaking about emerging markets, some markets, we need to understand that some markets might have some payment types that are preferable than cards, which is what we're used to. So if we're talking about Southeast Asia, for example, e-wallets are really big. and in many cases the preferred method of paying for online purchasing. And this has its own implications for fraud. So the types of frauds that we see in these payment methods, you might see a number of fake accounts increasing, and the difficulty of telling them apart from these new entrants into the online space, and these new customers. But also, and this is one thing that has been mentioned, is in terms of account takeover, the instances of account takeover have risen significantly. So fraudsters are taking advantage of the whole situation and performing social engineering, which has, with the sense of urgency of COVID, has become easier to do. And the fraudsters might take control of these accounts, might use the balance available in these accounts, but it might also use these accounts that might have good standing with merchants to load them up with stolen credit cards and commit fraud using what was previously a legitimate account. So yes, there has been a shift in there, and it's a difficult one to tackle because detecting these types of behaviors often requires using advanced technologies and advanced mechanisms such as machine learning tools. Yes, it's been a challenge for many in the space.
Luis, maybe do you want to add something? What do you see about the patterns?
Yeah, just to amplify what Carlos mentioned, markets like in Southeast Asia, where obviously wallets are very much used quite heavily, a lot of new account fraud is actually being taken place here. It's happening at a very early stages, so it doesn't necessarily mean that if someone creates an account today that they're going to use this account to carry out fraud tomorrow. They can let it go dormant for a period of time. They can even use it on for legitimate credit cards. Then once they want to use a stolen credit card, they could go all out on it. This is all things that do occur regardless of COVID, but we did see an increase of this, specifically account takeover. And the reason why we're seeing so much more account takeover is similar to what Carlos said. There is an increase of social engineering. There's different types of methods to test credentials. Obviously, if you're doing social engineering, you don't necessarily need to test credentials because fraudsters are pretty confident that the credentials or the login information they have is the correct one. But they do use a lot of different methods of credentials, whether they're actually testing credentials on the actual website itself, or a lot of times they don't even need to enter the website. I don't have to go into technical details, but there's methods of fraudsters using bots as credentials without actually opening up the website itself. So basically, fraudsters right now, I have screenshots galore. I see this all day long. Fraudsters advertising and posting stuff, social media. You basically find people who are looking for travel deals, last-minute deals. You contact them to find out what they want, what they're looking for, and they essentially purchase a flight for them in their name. A lot of times they're also taking advantage of other payment methods, buy now, pay later, which is causing a tremendous amount of problems. So there has been quite a bit of shift since COVID has occurred, but ATO and new account fraud is really what is kind of increased quite a bit.
Thank you, Luis. Monica, like at Chargebacks911, did you notice something else, or basically you are seeing the same patterns?
So I think social engineering is a huge contender, and it's not only increasing the likelihood of fraud, but also, it just you just have a network, and that communication network is constantly, you have people that are constantly exploring different loopholes, different ways to exploit the mechanism, whether it's front-end fraud or back-end chargebacks. Collusion is another thing that we've seen, take off. And part of this is you have a lot of merchants that, of course, they're under pressure. They do not have the resources to be able to respond to friendly fraud chargebacks. And we've caught numerous, we have found so many situations where the companies, the merchants' internal fraud and chargeback department ends up being associated with family members and all sorts of friends that are buying merchandise, buying tickets, and then filing a chargeback knowing that they're going to get away with it. So yeah, it's you can't be, you really have to make sure that you have a layered approach, and you have the right technologies, and continue to question everything you think you know, because it is, there's a lot of creative minds at work here.
Yeah, I mean, I can really imagine, and I heard like similar stories actually, where people externally, internally agreeing, that can be a problem. We talked before, I'm like, right now, what are the main patterns in obtaining, but did anybody see any testing new pattern, especially now that we are restarting? Do you see anything in this direction? Like, anybody will like to go first?
Yeah, so we do see really a change in trend. So specifically here in Europe with the PSD2 and the SCA, which has been enrolled, since the beginning of the year. So what we have observed extensively is that people change their buy behavior. So specifically fraudsters, they just book them 1 lakh transactions. So basically to reduce the average order value on individual transactions. We have also seen the trend towards a dimension where they really actively source the issuing countries, following on, literally the rollout of the SCA in the diverse markets and values. So basically when, I don't know, France was a little delayed in the rollout of SCA, or the thresholds applied in the tiers, they basically reacted properly on that to, specifically target those issued cards in those markets where they be secure that SCA will not, applicable, even if you as a merchant do not actively enable that. And that was, you really see that trend, right? That goes really in all directions, and you basically can really continue then the press releases of the individual governmental associations when the rollouts were announced. So that was definitely a trend which we have seen.
Anybody else? Did you see any trend in testing recently?
Excuse me, what's the question? Trends in testing?
Testing credentials.
Testing credentials. Yeah, I mean, for us, what we're seeing, because we work with so many different merchants, both in travel and actual e-commerce, is we're seeing one happening with manually. Actually, this is what we're all talking about with phishing or social engineering. A lot of times, fraudsters are aware that a lot of companies are using device fingerprinting solutions, or they're looking at other aspects or rule-based solutions. They're using emulators, they're using VPNs, they're using advanced tools to basically bypass device identity solutions. And then there's the other section. So there's manually doing it through social engineering. And then there's secondly is through automation. And this is being done with bots. One is actually testing credentials through the actual API. So as I mentioned, they're not even opening up the website. And these are extremely cheap and fast. And they're able to test credentials without actually knowing what's going on. So unless you're actually monitoring your API, you don't understand this activity is happening. And then there's the client-based bots, which are a little bit slower and more expensive, but are quite sophisticated, and they're changing quite a bit. So for example, a bot might change the person's IPs every few login attempts. They might vary between the login behavior, the timing, changing the device types, etc. This is all being done automatically, and basically the tools can hide most of their footprint. In many cases, people will not even understand if it's automation or if it's an actual manual fraudster. So it has changed quite a bit, and it's becoming more sophisticated.
Thank you, Louis. We have 10 minutes left, so from the audience, if you have any questions, just feel free to write those. We'll cover some of those. Next, I mean, like, we discussed and talked about what we see right now, but how the market and the merchants are preparing. So, I mean, right now we said that we are a little bit in this situation where we cannot really forecast, but we should prepare for new fraud trends and new fraud patterns. From a merchant side, how do you see this, and which priorities is having? Maybe Dennis, you can start.
Yeah, sure. I will try to make it fast given the time. So I think one of the good things is within the pandemic, last year specifically at Flix, we developed or used the time to develop a lot of in-house tools, everything which is post-capture, post-purchase. So we basically created a dedicated team, which we call ECDS, or e-commerce domain, who also has the power to see the full data streams and basically connect also the dots, a little isolated from the pure payment informations, which are typically gathered, to do fraud prevention. So this was one of the initiatives. I think for us, the biggest challenge, what we will continuously work on, and that will take a while, is to have an advanced set of, preventing the combination of a payment and voucher fraud, how they are associated to each other, and how is our company strategy moving forward, right? Because that is exactly the challenge. With marketing, sales, issuing vouchers, of course, always great. Exchange a paid ticket into a voucher, also great for the cash flow. But what does that really cause, on bottom line losses and chargebacks associated? I think this is something where we heavily invest in internally to basically scale that up to, at least when a second pandemic will hit us, that we could at least say lesson learned, and this is nothing we want to care about moving forward.
And surely interesting considering how much you're expanding now as well with the train business here in Germany and in
Exactly. We also invested a lot. The monopolism of Deutsche Bahn here in Germany has been fallen a couple of years back. So of course we also want to compete and also want to deliver an alternative. That's more on the business side, but I think the exposure in terms of fraud stays pretty much the same because our core channel is e-com. Of course, we do have offline world as well, which was compared to the e-com traffic rather minor. So the close attention will go to e-com fraud prevention activities in all dimensions.
Thank you, Dennis. Monica, on your side, how do you see merchants preparing for the new normal? Let's call it this way.
I think arguably the most important asset that worldwide every merchant would agree on, no matter what industry they're in, is that data has the most value. Data is king. Data is cash. So if you look at chargeback data, then this data arguably has more value than any other data, because this is the barometer of success, where not only can you understand how your customer service is performing, if you have collusion going on, what type of issues you may have in different markets, because as Dennis was pointing out, and Lewis as well, it's all about identifying the patterns. Of course, in the Latin America region, we know totally different fraud behaviors. So if you can't consume the fallout effect of your fraud prevention strategy and your sales and marketing strategy by understanding exactly what that chargeback data is telling you as real time as possible, then you're going to lose opportunities to improve. And what's worse, you're going to end up increasing the amount of risk to a point where now it's not palatable anymore, and it just becomes a guessing game of reactions every week saying, what can we do because we have this problem and it's a runaway train. So I think top initiative for any merchant is, make sure that, if most merchants today are multi-acquired, make sure that you have a facility to minimally get all of your data, normalize that data, understand what it means, and use that data to provide valuable business insight. Because this is no longer just a competitive advantage, it's actually the way of doing business.
Completely agree. Especially normalization, standardization, actually get insights and understanding your data. I think those are very, very important topics for everybody. Luis, what do you see in a nutshell?
Yeah, for us, we're still obviously airlines, or right now airlines, it's not a huge priority to, let's say, address or trying to change up their fraud prevention methods. But other I guess you could call it platforms or other areas like OTAs, this is more of a higher priority for them. OTAs were not as devastated as, let's say, airlines. They've had a steady stream and they're starting to come back more, and there's more services that they offer besides just air flights. So we do see that OTAs and other services that offer more services besides just their core, which is travel, does have a little bit more budget, has a higher priority, but it's still not anywhere near anything that we would like to see. Everything's being delayed. Obviously, the fraud prevention world is waiting for more people to start traveling again. That way we could create more need and have more priority to actually address some of the ongoing issues.
Thank you, Luis. We have a couple of minutes left. I would like to make just one round concluding and closing our discussion. Starting from Carlos, if you could say, like, just in a minute, a message that you would like to give to our audience, merchants, ODAs, or providers, what you will recommend to do or not to do in the next future.
So one of the recommendations is that you always have to keep conversions in mind, particularly if talking about emerging markets, where it is common for merchants to experience high decline rates for credit cards, particularly with large ticket purchases. You need to think that one of the best things that you can do is start using local acquiring versus using international acquiring. This is possibly the one that will have the largest impact in improving conversions. But for those transactions that don't convert, having a decent decline management strategy in place is very valuable. So going through the multiple acquirer solution, if it's possible, and also trying to retry decline transactions offering 3D Secure as a fallback for cards, for example. In some markets, 3D Secure might not be mandatory and might not be recommended initially for conversion reasons, but you might still be able to recover the transaction, and it still might be key to having these good conversion rates. And also keep track of the acquirers and channels that you've used for previous purchases to do repeat purchases on the ones that you see have the best conversions. If all fails, always the traditional solutions, which is having calls to action for customers to reach out to the banks and try to resolve the issues, but also very importantly, offering other alternative payment methods. So in the markets where alternative payment methods are available and also fairly common, it's usually a good recommendation to use cash or wallets as a fallback.
Thank you, Carlos. Dennis?
Yeah, I think that goes a little in line with what you just mentioned, Carlos. I think, approval and the conversion rate is one of the biggest indicators, because that's the Ferrari who drives the conversion and, the sales funnel top line. I think, we all know we will never eliminate fraud chargebacks at the end of the day, right? We always need to have a good balance. And I think that would also always be my advice, find the right balance, get the buy-in from your management, and then basically act on that appropriately and have a good strategy in place, specifically when it comes to, and we are here in Europe are largely exposed to PSD2 and SCA, right? Give enough room to explain customer what it is, train your customer service organizations on how they can literally support in converting those customers. And I think the majority of travel-related companies should rethink their refund policies to basically, avoid happening what we all have experienced a year ago.
Thank you, Dennis. Monica?
I would say one piece of advice: challenge the status quo. So if anything, we've learned this lesson over and over again. And, I know, speaking from Sandra, even from Microsoft, it becomes a level of comfort to just say, well, we don't need to change it. It's not broken. Well, the world has changed so much that it really is time to challenge, and change doesn't necessarily have to mean more expensive or bad. Change can mean, for example, through COVID, we ended up changing. We challenged everything that we did, and we thought, we require API integrations. Today, we use robotics and emulation technology and AI in order to allow merchants to integrate to us where they have no IT resources, because the world changed. People don't have resources available to do, what we had required. This is how an integration is done. You have to think outside of the box, and you may surprise yourself that there are other things that you haven't considered that may bring a lot more benefit and value to your whole organization.
Completely agree. Luis?
Yeah, my main action item, I mean, like, look, I realize this audience is mostly ATPS, or it is ATPS, so it's a lot of people dealing with payments. So just because you're used to dealing with, let's say, chargebacks, and that's what you're trying to stop, doesn't mean that ATOs are going to go away. I mean, ATOs are only going to continue to grow, and it's something that needs to be focused on early, so as early as possible, and fraudsters are just getting better at it. So my advice, my suggestion is that you want to be proactive when dealing with an ATO account takeover, a new account fraud. You do not want to be reactive when dealing with this. And on a further note, it's not just about, let's say, identifying fraudsters, but you want to identify good users early in the user session as well. So don't just settle for just challenging everyone with reCAPTCHA or second factor authentication. Only challenge the fraudsters and create a friendly environment for all the good users.
True as well. From my side, really, I would just say one word: understanding. I think it's the most important part. In order to understand things, you need to have data. You need to understand your data. You need to have the teams and the technology. So I think that's key in any kind of scenario, especially now where everything is changing so fast and probably will change again in 2022. So let's see and let's hope the best for everybody. I can say thank you to everybody for joining today and for having this very interesting discussion. And was my pleasure to talk to you.